This is the European Union, a group of member states collectively hosting 447 million people, the world's third largest economy after China and the United States. The EU also has 20 member countries using the euro, the second most widely used reserve currency after the US dollar, and reserves equal to all other currencies combined. The euro is so popular that 6 more countries in a dozen autonomous regions worldwide use it, despite not being EU members and having no control over monetary policy decisions. These regions are undoubtedly economically important, but they also have their problems. Free exchange of goods, services, labor, and currencies works best when participating economies have similar statistics. If one economy is clearly more prosperous than the rest, it will attract all the best talent, investments, and gradually become the center of a union that was supposed to be cooperative. The EU has a much more equal distribution of income and wealth than the global average, but it's also much easier for things like brain drain and capital flight to occur between countries with very few restrictions on people moving to live, work, and invest. Even adjusting for purchasing power parity, the richest economy in the EU has a per capita GDP 5 times higher than the poorest country. Some economists are starting to wonder how sustainable this can be in the long run. These concerns arose before considering other significant economic problems, such as the debt crisis that affected the economy in the last decade, Brexit, a war between its major energy suppliers, and a general shift towards less economic cooperation. We've talked a lot about what a collapse of the Chinese economy could mean for the world economy, and every time we address this issue, we always say that predicting the future is impossible and that it's highly unlikely that China will go anywhere in the near future. Speculations about the future of the EU will face the same problems. No one knows what will happen, but in terms of real economic threats to consider, it not only has a higher probability of disintegrating than a sovereign state like China, but also would probably have a greater impact on the world economy. At least exploring these economic issues can teach us a lot about how economic unions like the EU function. So, what are the major economic threats the European Union currently faces? What are the chances that these problems will lead other nations to leave the Union, as the UK did? And what would a non-unified Europe mean for the global economy? After this, we can place the EU in the National Economy Ranking explained. It's easy to think, especially for our younger viewers, that given its size, influence, and importance, the EU has existed for a long time. In reality, it's not even 30 years old. It will reach that milestone at the end of this year on November 1st, 1993. The original 2 member states signed the Treaty of the European Union. The plans outlined in a voluminous book envision common European citizenship with a common currency, alignment of foreign policies, and police and judicial cooperation. The original 2 member states were not entirely random. They were all members of the European communities, which were 3 organizations: the European Economic Community, the Coal and Steel Community, and the Atomic Energy Community. The first 2 integrated into the functioning of the EU, and the Atomic Energy Community, technically still separate, focuses on nuclear security and development, control of nuclear weapons, and research into technologies such as nuclear fusion in collaboration with other international organizations. Before the European communities, there was the Council of Europe, the Western European Union, and about a dozen other groups created with the goal of unifying European countries based on economic cooperation. After World War II, with the development of nuclear weapons and the growth of communist powers to the east, the motivation to unify skyrocketed. Some proposals that gained surprising appeal even advocated creating the United States of Europe, but nations with long traditions didn't like the idea of giving up their sovereignty. It introduced many of the advantages of being a unified country, but allowed members to retain their sovereignty, national identity, and much of their political autonomy. The EU also emerged at the right time. In 1993, it was post-Cold War, just when the world was in the midst of booming international trade and economic cooperation. It's impossible to ensure, but if the EU had formed a little later than the end of World War II, it probably wouldn't have been able to foster the level of interdependence and cooperation it has now. Because countries traded less back then, there was no modern financial infrastructure to facilitate business and cross-border transactions as much as today. Travel was more challenging, language barriers were much higher, and in general, economies were more self-sufficient because global supply chains didn't yet exist. Most things people bought then were produced in their own countries, unlike today, where most things are produced and shipped from abroad. This is important because the EU has policies that facilitate trade among member countries, but also hinder trade with non-member nations. This means that countries benefit from being able to trade freely with their goods and services, and even labor flows among other member countries without import tariffs, quotas, or labor restrictions. Together, these are the factors that really keep the EU together, not the headlines. What truly benefits the countries that have joined are the advantages of political cooperation, the benefits of free trade, those of a shared currency, and the ability to work freely across borders. This benefits both EU countries that can hire more skilled labor and workers who have access to job opportunities throughout the continent, not just in their home country. It's important to remember that the EU is made up of democracies, and governments make decisions about staying or leaving based on the will of their people. Even if it's not the best macroeconomic decision, all these advantages are also related to the right balance between centralized authority and maintaining national autonomy. If the EU had much more control over its member states, it would become a country like the United States of Europe, and many members wouldn't be happy and would leave. If the EU had less authority, it couldn't manage and enforce the necessary rules to ensure member nations of their benefits. If the EU were to fail catastrophically or even just lose members gradually, it would be because it can no longer maintain that delicate balance of authority and is already under threat. The global pandemic broke many production chains. Governments acted to curb the virus's spread by closing factories and controlling the movement of workers across borders. It made working from home more common. The war in Ukraine further fueled the ideas that countries should maintain self-sufficiency and not be vulnerable when delicate supply lines stop, on which they have become so dependent since the EU is so committed to free trade. This trend is a great threat. Working from home has also made it possible to be anywhere. Of course, there are many jobs that require people's presence, but most European economies are heavily based on services, with functions that can be performed remotely. Workers who don't even need to enter the country. Also, European companies look outside of Europe for highly skilled or lower-cost workers. Of course, this is an anecdotal example, but the E-team has researchers from the UK, Canada, and Germany, and writers from Greece, Morocco, and Ukraine, and then me from Australia. None of us has ever met in person, and all our work is done remotely. Maybe ours is a small example, but it certainly is not the only one, and it completely bypasses any of the labor advantages of being an EU member. In 1993, when the EU was formed, this kind of cross-border work was unimaginable. So the advantage of being able to hire workers from other countries and work freely anywhere in Europe was much more significant than it is for many member states. The ease with which its workers can go to work in other places is also becoming a burden. It makes sense that workers from countries with lower wages and who perform high-value functions move to other countries where they can earn more for their work. For example, a Romanian engineer earns much more working in Germany than staying in their country. This means that Romanian companies lose workers and will have to increase their salaries to compete with their EU partners. Brain drain is a major problem in Europe. Unlike someone moving from India to the United States, someone moving from Bulgaria to Ireland doesn't need to apply for a visa and go through the approval process. They would only need to move. The advantages of a shared currency are another double-edged sword. On the one hand, it greatly facilitates trade among member states, giving those states access to a world reserve currency that attracts much more international confidence than any of their individual currencies would. The possible exceptions would have been the French franc or the German mark, and of course the British pound. Although this specific example no longer applies, all other USB countries were obliged to conduct their international trade and take out loans in an alternative reserve currency, which can be expensive, complicated, and very risky if countries cannot access the currencies they trade in. They would be unable to pay for imports or repay loans in such situations. These situations are now occurring in Sri Lanka and Pakistan. Sharing access to the world's second most traded and widely held reserve currency means that EU countries will never find themselves in that situation. It seems that the benefits of a shared currency are quite compelling, but the drawbacks are also quite serious. When Greece had problems in the early 2010s, it dragged other EU countries into the Eurozone. Certainly, they were not blameless, but most of them probably could have avoided the prolonged economic stagnation that resulted from having to make monetary decisions to take care of the weakest economic link, namely Greece. Greece also suffered from using the euro during that time. When an economy experiences a recession, its currency devalues, actually helping attract foreign investment, trade, and tourism. If the Greek drama were to fall by 30% suddenly, a trip to the Greek islands would be 30% cheaper for visitors, providing the country with a source of income to pay its debts, purchase vital imports, and prevent the quality of life from collapsing. It works better if the country has investment opportunities, exports, or tourist destinations. The Pakistani rupee has fallen in recent months, but the price wasn't what was stopping people from booking their next family vacation in Mama Island. But this process doesn't work at all if the country doesn't have its own freely floating currency. While Greece was days away from bankruptcy, other EU economies, especially Germany, were doing well by exporting highly desired goods and services. With this method, the euro didn't plummet as much as it would have if it were only Greece's national currency. Greece did not get the self-correcting forces of the market that it would have obtained from a normal freely floating currency. The inflexibility of a single currency is causing problems today. Although 20 countries use the same currency, they all have different inflation rates. In Luxembourg, it's 4.8, which is high but not too far outside the range. If they manage their own monetary policy, they probably wouldn't need to take drastic measures. Estonia, on the other hand, has an inflation rate of 17.6, which is a problem and would justify a fairly drastic monetary policy. The European Central Bank has to set interest rates to suit everyone, which in periods of high inflation like now ends up being ideal for no one from a macroeconomic point of view. The advantages of the EU outweigh the disadvantages for its members. Countries that have recently become members have enjoyed higher growth rates, and overall, Europe has become a wealthier place, thanks to the Union. But people tend to see more problems than advantages, and it won't be macroeconomists who decide whether member states stay in the EU. It will be their voting population. What would happen if the EU collapses? The only correct answer is that nobody knows. It depends on how it collapses. A slow and steady exodus of countries from the Union, like a slow drip of Brexits, would harm economic growth for the next decade, just like in the UK. Estimates of the economic cost of Brexit range from 2.5% to 8% of British GDP, but it had some advantages that other countries would never have. It adopted the euro and kept its own currency, the pound, which is also a globally recognized and until recently widely respected world currency. Other countries would have to create a new currency from scratch, making even the most basic economic functions impossible until that system is established. Conservatively, economic losses would be at the upper end of estimates just scaled up to all of Europe. More realistically, it would cause a severe recession across the continent. Important questions would need answers, such as what happens to countries with euro reserves abroad and how obsolete currency-denominated debts are skipped. In this century, there have been many European communities, and although the EU has obviously been the most influential and successful, it's a bad plan to assume that it will last forever. Every country should have at least a plan for what would happen if their country decided to leave, or for what would happen if the Union simply fell. Hopefully, those plans never have to be put into action, but the job of a good economist is to know how to minimize the damage. Now it's time to put the European Union on the Nation Explained leaderboard. Yes, it's a national ranking table, so the scale isn't really intended for it, but here we go. Let's start with size. The European Union has a collective GDP of 17.2 trillion, the third largest economy if we trust China's official figures. Some economists have raised doubts about the possibility that the Chinese economy is significantly smaller than they say, and a second place could be claimed. A 10 out of 10 rating. Per capita GDP is quite high. Most EU member states are advanced service-based economies, and new Eastern European members are enjoying a boost in their growth rate. With a per capita GDP of $38,400, it gets an 8 out of 10. Stability and trust are interesting. The US has benefited from the combined strength of using a widely recognized world currency and sharing economic prosperity and challenges among member states. But it has also had many challenges in its short history. Still, it gets an 8 out of 10. Most international institutions would have more confidence in dealing with the EU collectively than with most states individually. In terms of stagnant growth, small growing economies don't contribute enough to offset the large economies that don't grow or regress. A 3 out of 10. And finally, the industry. This is where the EU truly shines, sharing technology, labor, and investment as far as needed to expand some of the world's most recognized companies that contribute value to the EU and global economy. Here is a resounding 10 out of 10, giving the EU an average score of 7.8 out of 10, placing it at the top of the ranking. Again, it was never intended to rank international organizations like this. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please leave a comment. Also, please consider liking and subscribing. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.